We are in Exodus. This is the second installment this summer. Exodus is the anchor story for the Bible. As we heard in maybe a surprising quote last week, a quote that I really like, Exodus is the only thing that ever really happens in the Bible. You have to think about it a little bit, but I think there's a significant truth to that. Exodus shapes everything that came before and after. Jesus knew Exodus, and he built his life around its themes, around its contours, and the living Lord that it proclaims. When we take a deep dive into Exodus, like we're doing this summer, we get to know Jesus better, his motivations, his miracles, and his overall ministry. So last week, Paul set the stage by showing how biblical Egypt takes on the role of the empire. The empire. I'm guessing we're going to hear that word a lot this summer. Empire is any human system of power that sets itself up as the ultimate authority. It becomes its own idol and sets itself against God. Empire is the anti-kingdom. And in the anti-kingdom, sin is no longer simply an individual choice, but is baked into the values and habits and laws of society. So as we pick up the story now in Exodus chapter 1, we're going to see the empire unmasked as the violent anti-kingdom that it is. And I think we will be horrified to discover how close this is to our world today. So scene 1 is massacre. Now, this is a family-friendly service, and somehow I keep ending up with these scriptures that have the hard things about them, so we'll really try and keep this at a G level, but it's hard. So the problems start out in Exodus, as we heard last week, with a new king who, as the Hebrew literally says, did not know Joseph. So not knowing is the key phrase here. Not knowing can be ignorance, that is, not having facts. But not knowing can also be no relationship, not having a connection. And as we see things unfold here, not knowing leads to fear, and then insecurity, and then discrimination, and finally harsh, controlling measures. Not knowing leads to objectifying people, othering them, and then saying that those others, are the problem. The problem isn't the ignorance, the fear, the insecurity of the majority. According to empire's way of thinking, it's the presence of the minority that is the problem. And that fear so easily turns into violence. And we know this from the world that we live in. These impulses are swirling all around us in this country and around the world. So this is where the story of Exodus begins. From that 3,000-foot or 30,000-foot view of oppression and enslavement, the story zooms down now in verse 15 of chapter 1 into the most intimate and private places of family life, where violence comes home. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives named Shiphrah and Puah, "When you are helping the Hebrew women to deliver their babies and you see the 2 stones, that it's a boy, kill him. But if it's a girl, let her live." The empire knows that the best way to destroy a nation is to go after the children. Are we willing to acknowledge how deeply this wickedness, this violence is rooted and active in our own world? Recently, I was reading a report about the abduction of Ukrainian children by Russian forces. And this is very hard to read. It's heartbreaking. Orphanages, schools, disabled kids are targeted, forcibly separated from their parents. sent off to camps for relief from the war, often far away from their original homes and sometimes right across the country, forced to learn and sing the Russian national anthem, educated against their wills into Russian citizenship. They are sometimes given new names, these Ukrainian kids. Laws are being changed to make it easier for them to be adopted by Russian families. It's almost impossible for them to be tracked or retrieved or returned to their original communities. So Ukraine has documented at least 20,000 children that have been taken in the last couple of years. And Russia boasts it has rescued 700,000 from the ravages of life in Ukraine. And Pharaoh says, kill the boys, but let the girls live. That is no Geneva Convention kindness on the part of Pharaoh. There's more than one way to destroy a life, and Pharaoh knows that. He's instinctively aware that in the ways of empire, gender-based violence is just as destructive, just as deadly. So everywhere we look, in our world, in our country, in our society, we are deeply stained by this violence against children. And who will deliver us from this body of death? Jesus' birth triggered the same genocidal reaction from the empire at the time. Different century, same story. Bethlehem was a small village, but Herod went after it with the same demonic fury. A cry was heard in the hill country, weeping and bitter lament. It's the matriarch Rachel weeping for her children. She refuses to be comforted, for they have been disappeared. Bethlehem was a small massacre in terms of world history. Scholars estimate maybe 24 boys for a village that size. But each one of those boys was a beloved, precious, unique human being, full of life and promise. So the numbers become irrelevant. The pain of losing one child is incalculable. So whether it's a genocide of 6 million or 215 or 1, each death is an idolatrous attack on God's kingdom of life and love. So where was God? Where is God in the face of such a massacre? Right in the middle of it. God was right there, has intimate firsthand experience. So when we tell God's story, let's make sure to include God knows what genocide is like. God was right there. The midwives, however, feared God and didn't do what the king of Egypt said. They let the boys live. Okay, these two women. How shall we describe these two feisty women? First and foremost, they feared God. They respected God, and because they respected God, they reflected God. They were ready to obey God rather than a man, no matter how powerful, how intimidating, how imposing he was. God was their confidence. God was their backbone. Do we have a similar confidence in Christ? A readiness to express our allegiance to Jesus? To build our lives on his words? To follow him despite any and all threats to the contrary? We don't know how Shiphrah and Puah became such gutsy, godly women. But their confidence in God in a time of crisis is legendary. Wherever the good news is told, the names of these two women is spoken. Okay, they feared God, but let's not think that that means that they are all serious. They are feisty and they're funny. These, I would say, are the first aunties of the Bible. The king of Egypt called the midwives and demanded, "Why have you done this? Why are you letting the boys live?" "Well, sire, the Hebrew women are different than your Egyptian women. They're strong. The babies come fast, and we just can't get there in time." How do you keep a straight face while pulling the leg of the most powerful man on earth and insulting him and his people at the same time? I think this is awesome. I can hear these aunties cackling all the way back to the Hebrew quarter. Humor is one of the best tools of the oppressed. It's a survival mechanism. It's an antidote to despair. It's a sophisticated way of drawing attention to injustice. And even at the physical level, laughter increases our pain tolerance. And to laugh at the powerful, that is the special privilege of the oppressed. It's a beautiful thing to hear, unless, of course, you happen to be among the Egyptians. But if you've heard it, you know the laughter of the oppressed. And God seems to have the same sense of humor as the midwives. He also laughs at the powerful. "Why the uproar, you nations? Why all your empty plans? Why all your plotting together against God's will, against God's Messiah?" The one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord mocks their arrogance. God doesn't seem to mind when the midwives bend the truth a little or a lot. Their civil disobedience aligns them with obedience to God's greater will. And God blesses Shiphrah and Puah in the currency of their obedience. He gives them their own families. So when you tell God's story, make sure you say that God laughs. God laughs at the pretension and the pride of worldly powers. God laughs until he decides it's time to stop the nonsense. Exodus will have more humor hidden among the reeds. But first, the story takes another downward turn. The empire strikes back. Pharaoh can't rely on the crafty midwives, so he makes a royal proclamation. The whole nation is now tasked with the genocide. Every Hebrew boy that is born, you must cast into the Nile River. Let the girls live. And so, into this murderous regime, a child is born. Now, a man of the clan of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. And she saw that he was a fine child, and she hid him for 3 months. But when she couldn't hide him anymore, she got a vessel for him and made it waterproof with tar and pitch. And then she put him in it and put it among the reeds at the edge of the Nile. His sister stood a ways away and watched to see what would happen. So this story, this scene, gives only the barest of details, but they are carefully chosen details to highlight what God is up to. We see a desperate mother trying to save her child. But the subtext tells us that this Hail Mary action is deeply rooted in God's plan and purposes. As horrific as the mother's situation, her dilemma is, it is part of God's story. How do we know? Well, the first hint. The child is born, and the mother, according to the literal Hebrew, says, or the mother saw that it was good. Does that sound familiar? That phrase takes us right back to Genesis chapter 1, where it shows up 7 times. God's word at creation. God saw that it was good. And so echoing that phrase here at this birth signals that God is embarking on a new creation project. God is still creator. He's still actively ruling this world. And now we've got a second hint. The woman put the baby in a vessel. The Hebrew word is teva. Now, this word is used in only 2 places in the entire Old Testament. It's used here, and it's used in Genesis 6 through 9. That's right. Teva is also the giant wooden freighter that was built by Noah. Translators call the teva in Genesis an ark, and the teva in Exodus a basket. I'm not quite sure why. And the other time that we see ark in English, the Ark of the Covenant, that's a completely different word. That means a box or a chest. So we have here another small clue to the new creation. God is at work to renew his world. He's firmly in control, moving the story forwards towards rescue and restoration. And so together with the other connections that Paul shared last week, these hints remind us that Genesis and Exodus are inextricably linked. There's one more hint yet that we're going to see that connects us to Genesis, but not just yet. So let's finish this story first, this scene. Now, Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe. Her maids were with her, walking along the shore. She saw the vessel among the reeds, and she sent a female slave to go get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. Hey, this must be one of the Hebrew babies. Now, the sister who was watching from afar came up and asked the princess, do you want me to go get a Hebrew woman to nurse this baby for you? Yes, please. Great idea. So she went and she got the baby's mother. Here, said the princess, take this baby and nurse him for me, and I'll pay you. So that's what happened. When the child was a bit older, the mother returned him to the princess, who adopted him, and she named him Drew, because she said, I drew him out of the water. You're supposed to laugh at that point. It's not Drew, it's Moses. Thank you. Okay, you are awake. I can't really see you. Are you awake? Good. Okay, thank you. It's Moses, yes, but that's how biblical naming works. Okay, good. You're with me? You're with me. Good. So here we have a remarkable scene of wickedly clever civil disobedience, outsmarting the authorities, told with wit sharp enough to puncture Egyptian pride. So Moses' mother follows the letter of Pharaoh's law, even as she disobeys, because she does put the boy into the river, as the law says. Secondly, Pharaoh's own daughter is duped into disobeying her father's royal decree. Thirdly, Moses' mother and sister engineering a life-saving solution for little Moses. The Hail Mary turns into a Hail Miriam. And what's more, they get Pharaoh to pay for it. At least it's the least he can do for all the free resource extraction that he's getting from the Hebrews. Finally, and I think this is the best one of all, they tell the story as though the Egyptian princess speaks Hebrew. Everybody knows, or would have known back then, that Moses is a perfectly good Egyptian name. It means something like son or born of. It shows up in other pharaohs' names like Tutmos and so on. And just like Miriam is also an Egyptian name that means beloved. But as the biblical storyteller puts it, this princess gives the boy a name that would confess that she is deliberately defying her father's orders. Sorry, Daddy, you know those slaves that you're so worried about? Well, I kind of like the sound of their language, and so I've been going for some tutoring. And you know those baby boys that we're supposed to kill? Well, we're supposed to throw them in the river, I know, but I just couldn't help myself. I pulled one out and I'm keeping him. Her father can't believe it. Pharaoh is in denial. Can you hear the chuckles as the Hebrews tell this story generation after generation? But there's one more thing. This scene is more than just about miracles and mirth, as potent as those dynamics are. I believe that there is one more connection to Genesis that goes really deep, that takes us right back to the beginning. And it starts with a question that was asked by a Bible scholar almost 40 years ago, and he wrote a book about it. What does Eve do to help? So this scholar looked at Genesis chapter 2, where the first woman was created as a helper, is the translation, and asked, how do we actually see this unfolding in the Bible story? Now, I wasn't that persuaded by that scholar's answer, but I think that his question is important. And I believe that Exodus shows us where we look to get the real answer. Where else in the Bible do we find such an intense concentration of female characters? We've got Shiphrah and Puah, the midwives. We've got Jochebed, Moses' mother, and Miriam. We've got the princess. She's got female attendants and female slaves. Nowhere else in the Bible do we find the stage filled with women. Nowhere. So Exodus is giving us clues in these opening chapters that this story links to the big story, to God's story. Creator is up to something, and here we see all these women, all these daughters of Eve. It's through these women that this new moment of recreation, of salvation, is coming to birth. And in the gospel, the story continues with another Miriam, Miriam of Nazareth. The Greek form of her name is Mary, but she's Miriam. She says yes to God, and she becomes the mother of the Messiah. Now, Jesus lives and works in a male-dominated society. He calls men as his disciples, but he also has a special place for women in his ministry. He accepts them as followers. He welcomes them. He talks to them. He blesses them. He heals them. He disregards the ancient taboos. And after it all, as he hangs on the cross, dying for the sins of the world, dying for our sins, it was the women who stayed to the end, who stayed to watch and witness and weep. And it was one of those women, it was another Miriam, Miriam of Magdala, who was the first one to meet the risen Lord, the first to experience the new creation that Easter morning, sent out to proclaim to the men that Jesus had risen. And so now, all of us, all who are choosing to follow Jesus, male and female together, we are the bride of Christ. We are called to be midwives to the new creation. Skilled, subversive, faithful, unafraid. In fact, the whole creation is waiting with bated breath for the big reveal. All creation has been groaning with birth pains from the beginning until the present moment. Even we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit groan inwardly as we await deliverance, our status as God's children, our new bodies. And so, when we tell God's story, say that it's a tale of birth and new birth. And we are the midwives of the new creation. So now, Exodus is going to fast forward from the infant in the river to Moses the man. And all we get is 3 brief snapshots covering probably a year or 2 or more. Snapshot 1. Moses witnesses a fight between an Egyptian and a Hebrew slave. Moses sees red and intervenes. Way too hard. The Egyptian is killed. And so we learn, despite his high-class adoptive home, Moses identifies with the Hebrew slaves. He is deeply moved by a sense of justice. His people skills, on the other hand, still need some work. Snapshot 2. The next day, it says, Moses sees two Hebrews quarreling, and he tries to be a peacemaker. But one of the Hebrews pushes back. Hey, buddy, are you going to try and kill me like you killed that Egyptian yesterday? And we learn these Hebrews are a tough crowd. They don't take kindly to interference, even if it's for their own good. And in case you're wondering, this is foreshadowing for the rest of the story of Exodus, and actually for the rest of the Old Testament, and actually the Gospels too, because this is not a Hebrew problem, this is a human problem. We don't like interference, even if it's for our own good. Anyway, Moses' secret is out, and we also learn that he is moved by fear, and so he flees the country. Snapshot 3, the women at the well. Moses is in the desert land of Midian and meets not one, but 7 young women at a well. To any attentive reader of the Bible, we know what's going to happen. It's at a well. This is the biblical equivalent of a Hallmark movie scene. So the women are harassed by some shepherd bullies, and Moses intervenes again. And this third time, he gets it right. So the girls are impressed, and so is their father. Moses finds a wife. 1 verse later, Moses and Zipporah have a son. The son's name is Gershom, which means a foreigner over there. And this name is a clue to Moses' personal growth, his sense of identity. Some versions translate this as, I have become a foreigner. But I think it works better to read it as, I was a foreigner over there. That is, in Egypt. Moses has left the palace, its privilege and its power. He's identifying with the Hebrews, which, by the way, wasn't originally an ethnic term. No, it was a social term, a social class, and probably a bit of a derogatory one. It was a slur, something that you would use to talk down to or talk about somebody you didn't respect. By naming his son this way, Moses is hinting that though he was raised in Egypt, he wasn't at home there. Here in the wilderness, with the simple comforts of wife and family, among sheep herders and the wise priest who is his father-in-law, he is finding himself. These are his people. This is where he belongs. Jesus left the infinite power and glory of the Father's side and chose to come down to this beleaguered, sin-infested world of human society. Jesus made his home here. He came down and said, these are my people. You all are my people. You know the gracious generosity of our Lord Jesus Christ. Though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that through his poverty, we might become rich. And so, when we tell God's story, don't forget to say, Jesus took up residence in our harsh world. The infinite became finite. Eternal love moved into our neighborhood, identifies with us, bringing his divine grace and mercy and peace and wholeness into our world, into our lives, up close and personal. Okay, the story of Exodus is going to pause here. We've been brought up close to the pain, the suffering, and the injustice that fills the world from ancient times until now. And we can see how much we have been compromised and infected by this world that is motivated by fear and insecurity and distrust. And we've seen a story full of grit and resilience and laughter and faith. But surprisingly, God has hardly been mentioned. We're told that God blessed the midwives after their faithful, feisty actions. But other than that, the story unfolds simply as a series of human events involving everyone from slaves to princesses and priests. Now, all of this is going on in front of a backdrop of untold suffering, unanswered questions, oppression with no end in sight. And so the storyteller interrupts the story to spell out the clues that he's been giving so on, to let us in on God's perspective and to confirm what all the clues have been hinting at. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help went up to God. God heard their groaning. God remembered his treaty promises with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God saw them, and God knew. God knew what was going on. God knew what he was up to. God knew them. Unlike the Pharaoh who didn't know Joseph, God remembered his relationship, his treaty, his covenant promises with his people. And ever after, in difficult times, in suffering, in despair, in oppression, God's people continue to call on God to remember his covenant. God, remember what you promised. Throughout the Psalms, God's people called on God to remember, to fulfill the promises, to eliminate the evils of empire, and to bring God's kingdom of grace and peace.